The human body is one of the most common forms of visual art. As a subject, it offers endless expressive possibilities, and it allows us to reflect upon, to come to terms with, and to greater understand ourselves. Um, because our notions of beauty are formed by personal experiences and societal or cultural standards, artistic depictions of the human body often reflect how beauty can mean something very different depending on the location or the time period in which a work was made. Um, Now, the human body can be more than just the subject of an artwork, however. It can also serve as the medium or the material used to create the work, or it can simply participate in an artwork through performance, dance, ritual, etc. Some of the earliest known works of art made during the prehistoric era were self-contained human figurines. Now, these have been found around the world, and they seem to have been some of the most common objects in some of the world's oldest civilizations. The majority of these figurines date to the Upper Paleolithic era, which is from about 40,000 to about 10,000 BCE, and the majority of these figurines appear to be female. Discovered in Austria in the early 20th century, the Woman of Willendorf is one of the most well-known and one of the earliest examples of these prehistoric female figurines. This dates to about 24,000 BCE. Standing on almost non-existent feet at just 4 3/8 inches tall, this carved limestone figurine features exaggerated female attributes. These include pendulous breasts, a large round belly, wide hips, full thighs and buttocks, and a clearly defined vulva. She also wears a sort of patterned textile or maybe a braided hairstyle atop her head, but her face does not have any facial features. Her head seems to tilt forward slightly, but we don't see any eyes, a nose, a mouth, anything like that. She has very small arms. Um, just a few kind of small details across the body, and the artist here has really taking advantage of the natural texture and shape of this piece of limestone. In fact, they've incorporated a natural indent in the stone and transformed it into the deep belly button in the center of the abdomen here. The clear emphasis on female anatomy that is present in so many of these prehistoric figurines has resulted in scholars sort of interpreting these as fertility figures. They've sort of argued that these may have been used as charms to encourage pregnancy or as teaching tools. Maybe these were ways in which women were celebrated as mothers and as the bringers of life. Um, but this interpretation has also sort of been expounded upon by the fact that many early scholars referred to these as Venus figurines in reference to Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty. The label Venus was first applied in 1863 when the French archaeologist Marquis Paul de Vibray discovered the first of these prehistoric figurines. He discovered this at a site near Lagier-Bassée in France, and he sort of playfully reversed this nickname that had been given to a very popular statue type from ancient Greece and Rome, which depicted the goddess Venus, um, often trying to conceal her breasts or her pubic area from view, almost in a way that made her seem sort of modest or shy. And so this type of statue was nicknamed the Venus pudica, or the modest Venus. And so Marquis here kind of reverses that name and calls this prehistoric figurine, the Venus impudica, or the immodest Venus. His inference is that the prehistoric Venus is making no attempt to hide her sexuality, and so is therefore clearly an immodest and erotic being. And so eventually, scholars began to refer to these figurines collectively as Venus figurines. But what kind of message does that send? We already have this assumed idea that these are representing the ideals of womanhood, of fertility, or maybe just female bodily or beauty ideals. We have this implication that these are erotic objects. And now, when associating them with the Roman goddess of love and beauty, Venus, that sort of underscores the idea that these are erotic or sexual objects meant to be viewed for pleasure. And it maybe even kind of creates this assumed association with religious beliefs, maybe some sort of association with deities or goddesses, maybe even an association with matriarchal societies. And so this is a good example of how words are just invented symbols for ideas, and words can both reveal and shape how we view the world or the ways in which we think about the world. It's certainly possible that a well-nourished body would have represented health and even fertility for prehistoric women. But more recent research has argued that amply proportioned female figures denote accumulated knowledge, experience, and continuity across generations, and that these figurines are meant to be older women rather than younger ones who have sort of sagging skin, wrinkles, um, which are meant to reflect their wisdom and their experience. But what would that mean for the Venus impudica, or this sort of skinny female figurine that doesn't seem to match the others? Well, perhaps these were used as teaching tools for young women to kind of show them the ways in which the female body changes throughout her lifetime. Maybe the thin female figures are meant to be young women, maybe prepubescent women even, and then the more exaggerated female forms are meant to be pregnant women or even just elderly women with sagging skin and wisdom and experience. Um, some other facts that have led scholars to kind of interpret these differently are the facts that the postures and the tiny feet on many of these figures would not allow them to stand alone. And most of these are quite small in size. They can usually fit within the palm of your hand. And so they would have been portable, tradable even. They would have demanded sort of a very personal level of engagement. And oftentimes, the materials that these figurines are made of, for example, the woman of Willendorf was made of limestone, that was not native to the region in which it was found. So this means that either the raw stone or the finished figurine was transported to that location at some point or another. And then, of course, we have the similarities between these figurines that have been discovered across a wide area of Europe and even in other parts of the world, all dating to roughly the same era. And so some scholars use this information to argue that these were subtle forms of nonverbal communication between isolated groups of Paleolithic peoples, and that they would trade these to signify friendliness or maybe a willingness to interact, to ally, or to intermarry between the groups. Another more recent theory argues that perhaps these figurines were made by women as some sort of self-portraits. This argument is presented by Catherine McCoy and Leroy McDermott in their article Toward Decolonizing Gender, Female Vision in the Upper Paleolithic, which was published in 1996 in the American Anthropologist Journal. In this article, the two authors argue that the over-exaggerated body proportions stem from the ways in which a woman would view herself by looking down at her own body. They describe this as the foreshortening effect of self-inspection. And so, from a woman's view of her own body, these figurines become a bit more naturalistic than they seem to be if we think about them being created by an artist who was looking at the female figure from an outside perspective. This would also explain why these figures usually lack facial features. Without any sort of reflective surface, the woman would not be able to see what her own head and face look like. And so they would have only based them off of, what other women's faces and heads looked like, or maybe based on what their own faces and heads felt like to their hands. So that would explain why the bodies themselves are given a bit more attention than the faces. In the 1950s, the Dutch-born American artist Willem de Kooning made a series of paintings of women that incorporate very bold and almost aggressive or even violent marks and slashing brushstrokes. Now, de Kooning was an abstract expressionist, and so that sort of helps to explain his very gestural painting style here. But he said that this woman series referred to, quote, the female painted through all the ages, all those idols. So here in de Kooning's Woman #1, he shows us a very exaggerated form and places emphasis on characteristically female elements of human anatomy, and sort of visually connects this modern artwork to previous depictions of the female form, including prehistoric figurines like the Woman of Willendorf. This is a large painting that was, of course, made thousands of years after that tiny sculpture was created, but the most prominent parts of the body are the breasts, while the arms and the legs are minimized in a manner that is quite similar to the Woman of Willendorf and some of those other female figurines. There is sort of a sense of the inherent power of women in both artworks, women as givers and protectors of life. However, they are still quite different from one another. De Kooning's Woman is very large, sort of physically imposing. The canvas itself is over life size. It's about 6 feet 3 7/8 inches tall. And so it sort of makes literal the very larger than life feeling that is conveyed by the Woman of Willendorf sculpture. Um, Now, de Kooning's painting also features glaring eyes and a sort of toothy, grinning mouth of the woman's face at the top of the composition, whereas the Woman of Willendorf and most of those prehistoric female figurines do not include facial features at all. And then if you would like to compare de Kooning's woman's facial features with those of more traditional depictions of, say, the goddess Venus, there's sort of a stark contrast. Again, de Kooning's woman is almost ferocious or terrifying rather than the soft sort of quote unquote feminine facial features and gaze that are shown on Venus. Now, both de Kooning's woman and the Woman of Willendorf and other prehistoric figurines feature a sort of abstracted human form. And this is sort of visible in the rough shapes that are used to create the Woman of Willendorf, and then the jagged brushstrokes that are featured in de Kooning's Woman 1. The appearances here make them less representations of individual people and more reflections of universal ideas about powerful women. And as de Kooning's statement suggests, Woman #1 embodies the female through all of the ages, not just the present.
In many cultures, the portrayal of the human body has followed conventions or prescribed methods that produce consistent results. The ancient Egyptians, for example, developed a standardized method of depicting human bodies and used it for thousands of years. A canon of proportions is a set of ideal mathematical ratios in art used to measure the various parts of the human body in relation to one another, and often used to convey cultural notions of perfection. The ancient Egyptian canon of proportions was calculated in the form of a grid that provides consistent measurements of the human body. In ancient Egypt, the palm of the hand was a unit of measurement. 6 palm widths equaled a unit of measurement called a cubit, and the height of an average man was an estimated 4 cubits or 24 palms. The proportion of the man's palm to the height of his body was therefore 24:1. The pharaoh's body was often used as the standard for measurement because all measure was believed to come from the king. Additionally, hierarchical scale used in Egyptian depictions of multiple figures typically shows the pharaoh as significantly larger than other figures because they were viewed as being of greater importance, as we saw with the palette of Narmer. Sometimes other ratios were used to make the grid, but this typically resulted in a slightly different, yet still standardized appearance. As a result of this canon of proportions and of these standardizations, ancient Egyptian depictions of the human body look very similar even when they were produced thousands of years apart. In sculpture, royal figures were shown either seated or standing, firmly connected to the stone from which they were carved, with their arms and hands close to their sides. In standing poses, the feet are firmly planted on the ground with the legs slightly apart and one foot in front of the other, as if the figure is about to take a step forward. Any suggestion of movement is potential, however, as if the figure is frozen. If it were in motion, its weight would shift to one side or the other. In the Egyptian figure, the feet are flat, the hips are even and immobile, and the shoulders are entirely square. The use of the canon gives the sculpture of Menkaure and his wife this austere strength. Their poses make the figures look rigid, calm, and enduring. They stand close together as a single unit, and the king has his hands close to his sides, while the queen has her hands sort of embracing his arm and torso. Their bodies do not twist, and the features are bilaterally symmetrical. The strong frontal pose here suggests that the power of the pharaoh is changeless, unwavering, and eternal. This representation is idealized. The couple's appearance is based on abstract concepts rather than direct observation, and the sculpture itself is meant to communicate these concepts and the qualities that ancient Egyptians were looking for in their leaders. The ancient Greeks closely copied the Egyptian canon of proportions and began developing their own lifelike and idealized sculptures. Archaic Greek sculptures, which date between about 620 and 480 BCE, like this Kouros or male youth on the left here, these tend to be nude, muscular, and youthful with a slight smile that is known as an archaic smile. They also tend to have long hair and a hairless face, which is meant to represent youth. The bodies here tend to be, again, kind of bilaterally symmetrical and quite static, except for one foot is slightly forward, very similar to that ancient Egyptian canon. Although here it's a bit different in that the stone is removed to show the space between the arms and the body, and then the space between the legs in order to suggest life and movement. Sculptures like this one on the left were typically used as grave markers for young men, in this case who had died in battle, while others were used as offerings at sanctuaries, typically for the god Apollo. Now later, in the classical period of ancient Greece, between about 480 and 323 BCE, artists developed more idealized proportions to convey perfection. For the ancient Greeks, the idealized human form represented high intellectual and moral goals. These figures tend, again, to be nude, but they are more muscular in general than the archaic figures, and they typically have short hair instead of the long hair. A sculptor named Polykleitos of Argos created the work seen on the right here. This is Doryphorus, or the spear bearer, and he used this work to exemplify his canon, which used mathematical ratios to create a harmoniously proportioned body. This sculpture also demonstrates the contrapposto stance, which was developed by ancient Greek artists. In this stance, the hips sort of shift to the side, placing the full weight of the figure on one active leg while the other remains relaxed and sort of bent at the knee. And the opposing arm is raised in an active motion while the other arm again remains relaxed. This causes the torso to twist in one direction while the lower body twists in another direction, and it creates a more sort of natural, lifelike stance that is more believably suggestive of movement. Ideal proportions inform many cultural notions of preferred body type. Our notions of beauty are formed by our personal experiences and by the society in which we live. If we look at the ways in which artists have depicted the human form, we will realize that in different times and places, beauty can mean very different things. The notions of beauty held by the ancient Greeks were based upon the combination of an underlying canon of mathematical proportions and the finely honed physiques possessed by male athletes who competed in the nude. Depicting the body without clothing allowed artists to study musculature and to reflect observations and knowledge of the anatomy in a way that a clothed body could not. Because the Greeks hoped to model themselves after gods, they aimed for a perfect balance between mind and body in both their lives and their art. Sculptures such as this one, the discus thrower, demonstrate the ideal musculature of the athletic body, and they celebrate the strength and virility inherent in the masculine form, as well as they show the competitor immersed in concentration with his mind in complete harmony with his physical form. In ancient Greece, the male nude was much more common, and artists did not depict nude females until the end of the classical period, but they draped them in tightly fitted clothing. During the Hellenistic period, which dates to about 323 to 100 BCE, nude women, especially the goddess Aphrodite or the Roman Venus, were shown in much more sensual ways. The Venus de Milo is shown here twisting her body in a very S-shaped pose, that sort of classical contrapposto stance here, and she appears unbothered by the fact that her drapery has kind of fallen down to expose the upper portion of her torso. Scholars think that one of her now missing arms was probably placed sort of across the front of her body over her pubic region, which is a pose referred to as Venus pudica, or the modest Venus. The other hand would have probably held an apple, which refers to the mythological story in which the young man Paris had to choose which goddess, Aphrodite, Hera, or Athena, was the most beautiful. Paris awarded the golden apple to Venus to signify that she had won the contest. Ancient Greek figurative sculpture was highly influential for European artists during the Renaissance, between about 1400 and 1600. The term Renaissance means rebirth, in reference to a renewed interest in the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome. Renaissance artists, inspired by classical sculpture, adopted idealized proportions, notions of beauty, and a sense of graceful naturalism, all of which are clearly visible in the figurative paintings, reliefs, and three-dimensional sculptures of this time. While the female nude did not gain respectability in ancient Greece until the late 4th century BCE, in Renaissance Europe, the female nude was an acceptable subject so long as it appeared in a historical or mythological context. Thus, many Renaissance artists sought to revive the appearance of the female nude as it had been depicted in antiquity. One such artist was the Italian Sandro Botticelli in his famous painting, The Birth of Venus. According to classical mythology, Venus, or Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, first emerged from the sea, fully formed as an adult, floating on a shell. Here, in this painting, Botticelli focuses on the moment when Venus has been blown to shore. She is wafted toward the land by Zephyr, the god of the west wind, who is accompanied by the earth nymph Chloris. Awaiting Venus is a goddess or a nymph who will wrap her in a blanket of flowers. Venus is shown with smooth, ivory-colored skin and long flowing hair, and she stands in an elegant pose, sort of an exaggerated contrapposto that gives her a very strong sense of grace. She sort of discreetly covers her nudity, indicating that chastity is part of her appeal. At this time, chastity was a very important virtue, and it had been in Greek, Roman, and early Christian traditions as well. And in the Renaissance, the nude body was depicted to suggest not only purity, but also fertility and reproduction. The graceful shape and the flawless quality of Venus's body here reflect the purity of the newborn goddess and create a harmonious and pleasing composition. Botticelli modeled his figure on an ancient sculpture, thus basing his conception of beauty on classical Greek standards.
Many African cultures believe that beauty is more than just external appearance, and that it involves internal or societal principles as well. Being calm, wise, and composed, for example, were important traits for kings of the ancient city of Ile-Ife. Now, this city existed in the country of Nigeria, and it's believed to be home to the ancestral Yoruba peoples. The Yoruba peoples are still occupying Nigeria today. In fact, they are the largest ethnic group in the country. So this is a terracotta head that dates to about the 12th to 14th centuries. And you can see we have delicate features, sort of elegant line work, this elaborate headdress. All of these things indicate that this is perhaps a king, or at least someone of sort of high social status. Now, the Yoruba people believe that the head is the seat of their life force or their power. And so careful lifelike details are used to sort of draw our attention to the face and the head here. Now, the book suggests that the fine vertical lines that are incised on the face here may be representative of scarification patterns, which are prominent in many African cultures. And these are created by cutting or branding the skin, and they're often considered markers of beauty. However, to my knowledge, the Yoruba king has a sacred status. If you think back to the lecture about art and political rulers, we talked about the Yoruba Oba wearing the special beaded crown with the beaded veil because he's so sacred and powerful, he cannot be looked at by regular people. Now, again, to my knowledge, this sacred status would not have permitted a knife or a branding tool to touch the king's face. So it's much more likely that the lines here, they do not represent scarification, but rather maybe they represent his veiled, beaded crown, or maybe something else. But beauty in this case is a balance of the invisible internal characteristics and then the idealized visible external form. This features very lifelike details. We have, plump lips, kind of a full fleshy face. The contours of the nose are very lifelike and clear. The folds of the ears, all of this is extremely naturalistic, but it's also idealized. It's been refined to sort of emphasize the gracefulness of the figure and the sort of calm, wise, and composed personality that this head is meant to reflect. Other cultures determine beauty by a person's ability to conform to expectations, be that through their clothes, cosmetics, or their body shape. Um, In Japan, traditional female performers who are known as geisha are renowned for their social skills and artistic talents, such as singing, dancing, or serving tea. Now, these are not courtesans or prostitutes, but they have a very professional relationship with their clients, and they are traditionally strongly discouraged from becoming too intimate with those clients. Now, a geisha's appearance is very specific and it changes over the course of her career. Um, During the early stages of her career, she wears a rather dramatic hairstyle, heavy makeup, including dark eyeliner and bright red lipstick to make her mouth look small. And then, as an apprentice in this stage, the source of her beauty is considered her outward appearance. Later, however, the source of her beauty is derived from her maturity and her gei, or her art. So after 3 years as an apprentice, a geisha wears a less elaborate kimono, which is tied with simpler knots, and she dons lighter makeup and simpler hairstyles. So here we're looking at um, an 18th century print by the artist Kagetsuro Dohan. This is simply titled Beautiful Woman, and this is from the Edo period in Japan. So Edo era artists were interested in depicting the beauties and the pleasures of life, including beautiful women like geishas. And so here, the artist sort of emphasizes the impressive attire and the relatively natural appearance, which sort of signifies that this is a more mature geisha who would have been appreciated, yes, for her outward appearance, but also for her musical skills, her gift with her gift for kind of intellectual conversation, and for her inner beauty and
The tradition
morality
of the
as well.
reclining female nude was established during the Renaissance as well. Modeled after Greek and Roman depictions of goddesses and nymphs, the reclining pose suggests entitlement, elite power, or status, as if the female subject is accustomed to being waited upon and is completely comfortable being observed in this state. These types of pictures also recall the ancient Greek emphasis on the beauty and honesty conveyed by the nude human form. However, in many cases, they also suggest the sensuality of the nude. The 16th century Venetian painter Titian was certainly influenced by the classical tradition when he painted this female nude, which is commonly known as the Venus of Urbino. The idealized female figure here lounges very sensually on this couch, gazing out at the viewer with a coy, almost flirty expression, casually covering her pubic area in a way that suggests modesty, yet also draws more attention to her nudity and sexuality. As mentioned with Botticelli's Birth of Venus, during the Renaissance, the female nude was considered an acceptable subject for artworks so long as it appeared in a historical or mythological setting. For this reason, artists commonly disguised images of nude women as images of Venus or Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, to make them somewhat more socially acceptable. Here, the woman holds roses in her right hand, which are a symbol of Venus and therefore a hint at the identity of this woman. Paintings of nude reclining women like this one became very popular, especially in court circles where upper class men could sort of appreciate Venus under the guise of a respectable interest in antiquity. In all actuality, this work was very probably commissioned by the Duke of Urbino to commemorate his own marriage. Several bridal or marital symbols and references support this theory. For example, along with their association to Venus, the bouquet of roses is also a traditional bridal symbol. Additionally, the sleeping dog at the woman's feet can be interpreted as a symbol of loyalty, fidelity, and domesticity. The attendants in the background may serve to connect the goddess to the concerns of real women, but notice what they're doing. They're either pulling clothing out of or perhaps putting clothing into a pair of large wooden chests that have been very intricately carved. These appear to be what are called cassoni, which were Again, these large kind of carved wooden chests that were very frequently commissioned as bridal gifts, and they were used to store other wedding gifts, the woman's dowry, her clothing, and other personal objects. So while this is very likely a likeness or at least a reference to the Duke's young bride, by suggesting that the painting depicted a mythological figure such as Venus, Titian was able to explore very secular themes such as the nature of love and desire in a more socially acceptable way. It's very clear that the French artist Edouard Manet was familiar with the Venus of Urbino by Titian when he completed his Olympia in 1863. Looking at them side by side, the compositions of the two paintings and the posture of the women within them are almost identical. Manet, however, has replaced the sleeping dog at the foot of the bed with a hissing black cat, and instead of the two maids in the background, there is a singular African servant who is bringing Olympia a large bouquet of flowers. In this painting, as in many of his others, Manet took a classical or traditional subject and updated it for his own time. In modernizing the reclining nude, Manet considered the reality of the situation. Why would a woman be naked and on display like this? Well, one obvious answer that was very common for the time period would have been that she was a prostitute. At this point in time, Olympia was a very common name used by prostitutes, but Manet also has taken this image and depicted her as a real woman. She is thin, or at least by the standards of the time, and very probably poor, as indicated by her sort of pale, almost maybe sickly skin tone, and again, her thin kind of figure. Olympia's pose here would have seemed confrontational because she stares out at the viewer in an assertive way rather than a coy or flirty way, and people at the time were much more accustomed to seeing passive women with voluptuous bodies and kind of soft, docile expressions, more like the figure that is depicted in the Venus of Urbino. So Manet is almost not only modernizing this depiction, but giving the female subject a bit more autonomy, perhaps. However, even though this was revolutionary for its time, by showing a so-called real woman, Manet's Olympia stood beside other European modernists in representing what has now come to be called the male gaze, with a passive female body on display, presumably for a male spectator who has more power than she does. Between 1988 and 1990, the Japanese artist Yasumasa Morimura revisited this theme of the reclining nude, making a direct reference to Manet's Olympia, which in turn referenced Titian's Venus of Urbino. Here, Morimura employs digital processes that allowed him to play the roles of both Olympia and the servant. The resulting photograph is part of a series that the artist made in which he impersonates famous female icons from Western culture, transcending race, gender, and ethnicity. Here, the act of covering the genitalia with the left hand takes on an entirely new significance in disguising the truth of the subject's masculinity. The robes of the earlier pieces are replaced with a kimono, and the cat at the foot of the bed is a porcelain lucky cat, which is commonly found in Japanese restaurants and shops as a talisman of good fortune. Morimura's reclining nude updates this theme with current technology and raises pertinent questions about identity, suggesting that appearances can be deceptive, that race and gender are artificial constructs, and that we shouldn't make assumptions about identity based on what people look like, and that our understanding of who we are is very much influenced by the past. In the late 20th century, Angolan conceptual artist Kiwanji Kiahinda revisited the theme of the reclining nude from a post-colonial perspective. Their work, titled Great Italian Nude, presents a black man lounging on a lavish red leather couch. The blackness of his face is exaggerated by makeup or a mask, and he wears an elaborate headdress. This scene not only reverses the male gaze, but also focuses on the reclined body of an exotic other or outsider, a black African man in this case, rather than a white European. Instead of leaving the black body in the shadowy background, as in Manet's Olympia, he sort of highlighted the figure with the bright sunlight. We see a starkly different backdrop with the couch balancing on this sort of rocky ground surrounded by water rather than being in a sort of internal setting. This setting recalls the Atlantic coastline of the artist's native Luanda and the Mediterranean lagoons, canals, and rivers in and around the city of Venice, where Hinda made this piece during an artist's residency. Despite living through decades of civil war in Angola, Hinda is inspired to see humor as an important way of getting people's attention and allowing meaningful engagement with each other as well as with history, even though that history is often quite troubling. According to Hinda, he wants to create a quote-unquote trap for people to have narrow ideas about Africa and use art to make the distance shorter between cultures. In this piece, assumptions about cultural ideals are questioned, new models of understanding, communication, and inclusion are suggested, and possibilities for interconnection are expanded.
In the late 20th century, many artists began deliberately focusing on trying to challenge preconceived notions about the human body, and in particular, female bodies. The British painter Jenny Saville is an artist who has chosen a somewhat unconventional approach to depicting the female body, and she says that she uses her own body as a prop that she is, quote, willing to distort and manipulate. Her works comment on the conflicted relationship that women often have with their own bodies. Now, Seville has described herself as being anti-beauty, and by this she means that she focuses on exaggerating bodily elements that society has often or generally deems as being unsightly or unwanted. In this monumental nude self-portrait titled Branded from 1992, we see Seville with her head sort of barely squeezed into the frame. Her breasts and her stomach are far more prominent at this sort of strange angle. Um, she glances down at her own body with a look of disgust or disdain and pinches this roll of flesh on her stomach. Um, the odd colors of her skin are based upon photographs and medical illustrations of various flesh tones, bruises, dimples, pockmarks, etc., sort of flaws or problems on human skin. And then she's also inscribed the body here with various words. We see things like supportive, decorative, delicate, petite, irrational, and more. And so this image, this figure, it's meant to counter contemporary society's bias towards thin women. And it's commenting, again, on this conflicted relationship that women often have with their own bodies and on society's unreasonable expectations of how they should appear in order to be considered acceptable or attractive. French performance artist Orlan takes this idea even further by adopting her own body as the literal medium for her work. Beginning in the 1990s, she underwent a series of plastic surgeries that transformed her appearance, and she documented the process. The operating room became the stage of her performance. She was the star, the medical team was the cast, and the costumes used were created by famous fashion designers. During the procedures, she was only given local anesthetics so that she could remain conscious, and she often read out loud from philosophical and poetic texts. Video cameras in the operating rooms transmitted live feeds to CBS News, to the Sandra Guerin Gallery in New York City, and to the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. She also documented the stages of healing after these various procedures. Her final form was that of a composite woman modeled after numerous famously beautiful depictions of women. She modeled her chin after Botticelli's Venus, her mouth after depictions of the Roman deity Diana in French Renaissance paintings, her nose after Psyche, the mythical lover of Cupid, and her brow after Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. She says that this work aims to intervene in historical representations of women in art by actively determining her own appearance. She's trying to comment on ways technology empowers us to transcend human limitations, to critique the cult of beauty that imposes unfair standards on women, to make a statement about the impossibility of physical perfection, even in an age where plastic surgery is pretty routine. And her extreme measures really expose the tyranny of society's preconceptions about physical appearances and the extreme insistence on stereotypical notions of female beauty. And by taking possession of her own body and asserting her right to do with it as she sees fit, she is directly challenging these standards. So in performance art, the human body or its actions become the artwork. It is the body as the material or the medium, or the art object rather than simply the subject. The human form in action is meant to engage the viewer's various senses through movement, expression, sight, smell, etc. Oftentimes, performance art activates the surrounding space that is shared with the audience, and so it becomes an entire experience. These types of artworks are not fixed or static or permanent. They can really only be preserved or re-examined indirectly through documents such as writings, photos, or videos. And so these often have sort of an element that reminds us that time passes during the performance. And so remember that the photos, the videos, the documents, etc., those are not the artworks. It's the performance itself that is the artwork. In some cases, however, the performance art can also create art objects. So here we have the artist Yves Klein. He was inspired by martial arts, specifically judo, and he started using women's bodies as the vehicle for applying paint. These were public performances that were accompanied by an orchestra. They would create monochrome compositions, and during the performance, the orchestra would play a single chord for maybe about 20 minutes, and then there would be 20 minutes of silence, then another chord, then another 20 minutes of silence, and so on. And so here you can see some of the final art objects that were produced through these performances. The artist Janine Antony used her own body and actions for the basis of her performances. Here is a work from 1993 titled Loving Care, in which she mopped the floor with her own hair after dipping it into a bucket of hair dye. Both of these things are considered traditionally feminine actions, dyeing your hair, but also ideas of domestic activities like cleaning, cooking, etc. And so we have ideas of domesticity, of femininity, and by doing this performance, she is sort of reclaiming her own space and her own agency. Here we have Yoko Ono. She is a performance and conceptual artist from Japan who settled in New York in the 1960s. This particular performance is titled Cut Piece. She first performed this in Japan in 1964 and then repeated it in New York City in 1965 at Carnegie Hall.
So for this performance, Ono sat passively on a stage while members of the audience were invited to use the provided sewing shears to cut away bits of her clothing and take with them. Now, the performance was charged with implicit violence and eroticism as more and more of her body was revealed by the deliberate actions of the audience. Now, this wasn't necessarily considered feminist at the time, but Yoko Ono has since said that this performance was meant to be against ageism, racism, sexism, and violence. Another example is Chris Burden's performance titled Shoot from 1971, where he stood in an art gallery and had his friend shoot him in the arm with a rifle. Now remember, these are photographs of the performance. The photographs are not the artworks. The performance was the artwork. Now, this might seem a little crazy, but if we think about the context of this time, what was going on? Well, in the 1970s, the Vietnam War was one of the most controversial issues in America. There were lots of arguments about whether we should or should not be involved. And so Chris Burden is sort of taking this idea of guns or of shooting out of the context of war and forcing the viewer to consider it differently when it's not, when it's not associated with war or specifically the Vietnam War. Do we see it differently? He's also using his own body to express this concept and to explore the idea of how when we break the body's physical limitations, we in turn break the mind's limitations. And so putting our bodies through extreme pain or ecstasy or transformations can cause us to see things differently as well. Here we have Vito Acconci, the performance and conceptual artist. This was his following piece from 1969. It was part of a series titled Street Works, and this was a 23-day activity. So every day from October 3rd to October 25th, 1969, he would go out and choose a person, basically at random, on the streets of New York City in a new location each day, and then he would follow that person wherever he or she went, usually until they reached a private place. Now, sometimes this would only last a couple of minutes. I believe the longest was he followed someone for 9 hours, and then he had a photographer following him and documenting this experience. This was part of a series of conceptual events which were sponsored by the Architectural League of New York, which was going on at the time, and so it required doing a piece using a street in New York City. Now, why would he choose to follow people for this piece? Well, he's thinking about the language of our bodies in public spaces. In one sense, he's sort of submitting his own movements to that of others, kind of connecting his body to that of other people, and showing how our bodies are always sort of subjected to external forces. In another sense, and according to his own notes, he's adding himself to another person. He's giving up control over his own body, and he's using both of their bodies as objects of art to explore these various ideas. And this was also just part of the revolution that was performance art that was happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It brought art out of the gallery and into the street to sort of explore real issues such as space, time, and the physical human body. Ana Mendieta was a Cuban-born artist who was sent to Iowa in 1961 through Operation Peter Pan. This was the relocation of 14,000 Cuban kids after 1959 when Castro and communism took over the country of Cuba. Mendieta was rather traumatized by this. She was haunted throughout her life by a sense of personal dislocation, and her artworks tend to reveal a need for a deeper connection to her physical surroundings. She was interested in the natural elements and biological cycles, and she was inspired by other performance artists and traditions associated with Afro-Cuban Santeria practices, but her works are also very autobiographical. She usually situated her body in various outdoor environments, sometimes on the ground, here in front of a tree, or in sort of this rocky ravine covered in plants, sometimes on a sandy beach, various places. And then she works to connect her own body to the location. So in the Tree of Life series, she invites the tree to absorb her and connect her to the earth as the maternal source of life. And so she did over 200 of these types of performances or series, and her body often leaves somewhat of an imprint or trace of her own form on nature. She was once quoted as saying, "Through my earth body sculptures, I become one with the earth. I become an extension of nature, and nature becomes an extension of my body. This obsessive act of reasserting my ties with the earth is really the reactivation of primeval beliefs in an omnipresent female force. The after-image of being encompasses with the womb is a manifestation of my thirst for being." The last performance artist that we'll look at here is the Serbian performance artist Marina Abramović. She started performing in the 1970s, and she uses her body as the subject and the medium of her performances. She typically tests her physical, mental, and emotional limits in a quest for heightened consciousness, transcendence, and self-transformation. Her performances are characterized by endurance, pain, and repetitive behaviors. So there is a link to watch a documentary titled "The Artist is Present" about Marina Abramović, and a performance that she did in 2010, and you guys will write a short response to that, but we'll look at a couple other examples of her works here as well. So this work was titled Rhythm 5, and it's from 1974. And these are 4 photographs from the performance. Once again, let me just remind you, the photos are not necessarily the artwork, but the performance itself was the artwork. But this was a 90-minute performance in which she created a star shape made out of wood shavings on the floor, and then she covered that in gasoline and lit it on fire. She then spent time walking in circles around the burning star, trimming her fingernails and her hair, and dropping the trimmings into the fire. Then she entered the star and laid down within it. However, due to the lack of oxygen and the amount of smoke within the center of the star, she lost consciousness, and when her body relaxed, her leg fell into the fire and her clothes caught on fire, and the audience ultimately intervened and pulled her to safety. Now, after this performance, you might think she would never perform again. However, she said that it was then that she, quote, "realized the subject of my work should be the limits of my body. I would use performance to push my mental and physical limits beyond consciousness." Rhythm 0 was a 6-hour performance in Naples in 1974, in which Abramović stood completely still in a room, and the audience was invited to do with her whatever they wished, using one of the 72 objects that she had placed out on a table. These objects included things like a rose, a feather, perfume, honey, bread, but also things like a scalpel, nails, and a gun loaded with 1 bullet. Now,
This performance was meant to be exemplary of her belief that confronting physical pain and exhaustion was important in making a person completely present and aware of themselves. And she also wanted the viewers to become active participants in the performance and to sort of see just how far the public would go. Now, the performance started off relatively tame, but by the third hour, her clothes had been cut off. By the fourth hour, some members of the audience had begun to cut her skin, while others tried to protect her. They wiped her tears and tried to place items of clothing back on her body. But then one audience member took the loaded gun and placed it in her hand and made her hold it to her own head with her finger on the trigger. A fight broke out amongst the audience members, those who wanted to protect her versus those who did not. And eventually the gallery owner stepped in and announced that the performance was over. At this point, Marina Abramovich began to move around the space like a person again, and she said that the audience was suddenly unable to face her, and they all bolted from the room. They had all objectified her to such an extreme state that they couldn't bear to look at her in the face as a human being any longer. Here we have a work in which Abramovich and her partner Ulay are both holding on to a bow and arrow. He holds the string and the arrow, and she holds on to the bow, and they both lean backwards. And they stayed this way for 4 minutes and 10 seconds. And this performance was meant to explore the fragile line between life and death. If he were to lose his grip or his balance and fall backwards and let go, that arrow would be shot directly at her heart. Now, during the performance, they both wore small microphones on their chests that picked up the sound of their heartbeats, which became much more intense as the performance went on. Abramovich and Ulay met first in 1976, and they began their relationship. They lived a nomadic lifestyle together and traveled and performed across Europe for several years. This particular work, Relation in Time, involved spending 17 hours with their hair tied together, but they explore other extremes in other works as well, including running into each other full steam, naked, slapping each other, screaming in each other's faces. Here, in this performance from 1977 titled Breathing In, Breathing Out, they spent 19 minutes with their mouths sort of just centimeters apart, breathing in and breathing out the same air. And they also did performances like this, in which they stood both completely nude for 90 minutes within this already very narrow hallway of, I believe, an art gallery, and forced the visitors to sort of squeeze in between their naked bodies. In 1983, Abramovich and Ulay began their ultimate collaboration. They announced their project titled The Lovers, in which they proposed to become the first people to walk the length of the Great Wall of China. Each would start at the opposite ends, and they planned to meet in the middle, each having walked about 1,242 miles, and they planned to get married once they had met in the middle. Now, it took several years to plan this project and to get the permissions and things. They began their walks on the 30th of March, 1988, from either end of the Great Wall. 90 days later, when they met in the middle, they realized they had grown apart. And after spending a little bit of time together and giving a short press conference, they each went their separate ways, and they didn't see or speak to each other for 22 years. They were reunited briefly at her performance in 2010 titled The Artist is Present. So when you watch the film, you'll get to see this particular interaction between the two of them, and you'll get to learn a lot more about the way she approaches